Somewhere in the coldest corner of southwest Alaska, there is a lake so big you could lose an entire small country inside it, and so remote that more people summit Mount Everest in a single year than set foot on its shoreline. For 8 decades, pilots, fishermen, and scientists have reported the same impossible thing swimming beneath its surface. Nets have come back shredded. Boats have come back dented. And now, new evidence is forcing researchers to ask a question they used to dismiss with a laugh: what if the stories were never just stories? This is the lake the locals warned their children about long before anyone wrote it down in a report or a headline. This is Lake Iliamna. Lake Iliamna sits tucked into the Bristol Bay region of southwest Alaska, roughly 200 miles from the nearest stretch of paved highway. It is the largest lake in the entire state, and the 8th largest freshwater lake in the United States, stretching about 77 miles long and 22 miles wide, spreading out across more than 1,000 square miles of dark, cold water. In places, the lake bottom drops away into basins over 1,000 feet deep, carved by glacier, and never fully charted by modern survey teams. A single river, the Kachak, links the lake to Bristol Bay and the wider Pacific, and through that narrow artery millions of sockeye salmon pour in every summer on one of the greatest fish migrations left on the planet. Where that many salmon go, something always follows. That is simple ecology, not folklore. But the people who have lived along Iliamna's shores for thousands of years, the Dinaina and the Yupik, describe something that goes well beyond an ordinary predator drawn in by an easy meal. For generations, elders in the villages around the lake spoke of a creature living in the deepest, coldest parts of the water. Descriptions varied slightly from community to community, but the core details lined up again and again: a long, powerful body, unusual intelligence, and a habit of moving in ways that no local fish was known to move. Some accounts described it striking upward from below with a kind of deliberate precision, as though it understood exactly what it was doing and why. Families passed down a simple rule for their children, one repeated so consistently across generations that it reads less like superstition and more like a survival manual. If you see something large disturb the water, you do not linger to get a better look. You leave, and you do not return until the surface is calm again. For a long time, outsiders treated that rule the way they treat most old lake legends, as a colorful piece of local color, a story meant to keep restless kids away from dangerous water. Cold lakes have a way of killing people through hypothermia, sudden storms, and unpredictable currents, so a rule that keeps children cautious near the shoreline makes sense on its own, no monster required. But then came a string of sightings from people who had no interest in local folklore at all, and no reason to invent anything. The first sighting that put Lake Iliamna on the map beyond its own villages happened in 1942. A bush pilot, flying low over the lake with a government wildlife surveyor in the passenger seat, looked down through unusually clear water on a calm day and saw something neither man expected. Below the plane, moving together in a loose but coordinated group, were more than a dozen large shapes, clearly living animals rather than logs, shadows, or schools of ordinary fish. The pilot and his passenger both estimated the animals at roughly 25 to 30 feet in length, with bodies that seemed to catch the light in a silvery, almost metallic way as they moved. Bush pilots in Alaska do not last long in the job if they are careless observers. Reading terrain, water, and weather correctly is a matter of survival, and this particular pilot had logged countless hours over that same lake. He knew exactly what a shadow, a sandbar, or a pod of ordinary fish looked like from the air, and he was certain this was none of those things. His passenger, a trained wildlife official, backed up the account. 2 credible witnesses, describing the same extraordinary scene, at the same moment. The report was filed and largely forgotten, because in 1942 the country's attention was fixed on a very different kind of danger overseas. The creature, or creatures, did not disappear along with the headlines. Sightings kept surfacing every decade or so. In 1977 a pilot reported 2 enormous dark shapes gliding beneath the water, far larger than any fish known to live in Alaskan lakes. A decade later, a group of hunters described something massive passing directly under their boat, rocking the hull with the force of its wake, visible only as a shifting shadow and a sudden swell of displaced water. Then, in 1988, came the sighting that is still the most talked about on the lake. 17 separate witnesses, a mix of locals and visitors with no shared agenda and no prior interest in cryptid legends, reported watching multiple large animals surface and dive just offshore, showing portions of their bodies before slipping back under. 17 people, describing the same basic scene, at the same time, with no obvious reason to coordinate a story. By 1979, the mystery had gotten serious enough that the Anchorage Daily News put real money behind it, offering a $100,000 reward for solid proof of whatever was living in Lake Iliamna. That kind of reward pulled in expedition teams with sonar rigs, underwater cameras, and submersibles rated for the lake's deepest basins. Crews dropped hydrophones to listen for anything unusual and combed as much of the 1,000 square miles of surface area as their time and budget allowed. Nobody ever collected that reward. No body was recovered. No specimen was captured. No single piece of video or photography settled the question once and for all. But the search teams did not come back empty-handed either. They logged sonar returns of large objects moving through the water column at depths where nothing that size was supposed to be. They recorded acoustic signatures that did not neatly match known fish, marine mammals, or geological noise. They captured blurry, ambiguous underwater footage of something large and clearly alive that vanished into the murk before cameras could resolve it into anything identifiable. It was exactly the kind of evidence that raises more questions than it answers, suggestive, frustrating, and never quite conclusive. Eyewitness accounts are always the shakiest kind of evidence, because memory bends and expectation shapes perception. A floating log at the right angle, in the right light, can look like almost anything if you already believe something is out there. But the physical damage reported around the lake is harder to wave away with psychology alone. Local fishermen have described commercial-grade salmon nets, built to hold hundreds of pounds of thrashing fish, coming back not tangled or snagged, but torn apart in ways that suggest raw, deliberate force. Boat hulls have returned scratched. Propellers have come back bent or damaged. Hooks meant to hold heavy fish have been found twisted into shapes that look less like metal fatigue and more like something grabbed hold and pulled. The most unsettling reports involve boats being struck from below in stretches of the lake where the bottom is soft sediment rather than rock, meaning there are no natural underwater features that could explain a sudden violent impact. Fishermen describe hits hard enough to throw people off balance and leave visible damage on the hull. None of that proves the existence of any specific animal. But it does point to something solid, something with mass and force behind it, moving through water where, on paper, nothing that large should be. So what is the most scientifically reasonable explanation? Many researchers point to the Pacific sleeper shark, a deep, cold-water predator related to the Greenland shark of the North Atlantic. Greenland sharks are famous among scientists for their extraordinary lifespans, with some individuals aged at several hundred years old, making them the longest-lived vertebrates known. Pacific sleeper sharks share a lot of the same traits: a preference for cold, deep water, the ability to grow past 14 feet, with some researchers suspecting even larger individuals exist, and a slow, powerful ambush hunting style. Crucially, sleeper sharks can tolerate a range of salinity, and Lake Iliamna does have an open connection to the Bering Sea through the Kvichak River, the same route the salmon use every year. On paper, the sleeper shark theory checks a lot of boxes. It explains the size range reported by witnesses. It explains a preference for staying deep and surfacing rarely. It could plausibly explain torn nets and damaged hulls. And it explains why, despite decades of searching, no one has produced a body. These are animals built to live and hunt in the coldest, darkest, least accessible parts of a very large lake. But the theory has real gaps. No Pacific sleeper shark, has ever been officially documented inside Lake Iliamna itself. No carcass has washed up. No specimen has been pulled from a net and identified. And some details from witnesses simply do not fit a sleeper shark's known biology. Multiple accounts describe animals in the 25 to 30-foot range, notably larger than any confirmed sleeper shark on record. Several sightings, including the 1942 flight and the 1988 mass sighting, describe groups of animals moving together in a coordinated way. Sleeper sharks are solitary hunters. They do not travel in loose formations, and they are not known for anything resembling group behavior. If sleeper sharks are part of the answer, they would have to be behaving in ways completely outside their documented biology. That gap between known animal and reported behavior is exactly where newer research has started to get interesting. Environmental DNA sampling, often shortened to EDNA, has become a serious tool in modern wildlife biology. Every living creature constantly sheds tiny amounts of genetic material into its environment through skin cells, waste, and mucus, and that material can be collected straight from water samples and sequenced. It is a way to detect what is living in an ecosystem without ever seeing or catching the animal itself, and it has already been used to confirm the presence of rare and elusive species in lakes and rivers around the world. Environmental DNA sampling conducted in and around Lake Iliamna has turned up something researchers did not expect: a portion of genetic material that does not cleanly match any species currently logged in existing databases. Scientists involved in that kind of analysis are careful, and rightly so, not to oversell an ambiguous result. Unmatched DNA in a water sample can mean several mundane things. It might come from a known species whose genetic record in public databases is simply incomplete. It could reflect contamination during collection or processing. It could be a sequencing artifact that clears up under closer analysis. Responsible scientists list all of those possibilities first, because that is how good science works. But they also acknowledge, quietly, that an unmatched result can occasionally point towards something that has simply never been formally catalogued, especially in a lake this remote and this poorly studied. That uncertainty is the honest state of the mystery today. Nobody serious is claiming a confirmed new species. What we actually have is a stack of unresolved evidence, 80 years of eyewitness reports from pilots, fishermen, and villagers with no obvious motive to lie, physical damage to boats, and nets that has never been fully explained by ordinary wildlife, sonar and acoustic anomalies picked up by well-equipped, well-funded search expeditions, and now a genetic sampling result that does not slot neatly into any known Alaskan species. None of these threads is proof by itself. Stacked together, they are the reason the mystery has refused to die quietly for 8 decades. There is also a broader pattern worth remembering. Lake monster legends exist all over the world, from Loch Ness in Scotland to the Ogopogo of Lake Okanagan in Canada, Champ in Lake Champlain, Nahuelito in Patagonia, and Mokelmbem in the Congo Basin. Skeptics have long treated these as cultural stories, ways for isolated communities to explain the unknown and keep curious kids away from dangerous water. And in many cases, that is almost certainly true. But there is also a genuinely interesting scientific idea sitting underneath some of these legends. During past ice ages, sea levels and glacial geography were very different, and some lakes that are now landlocked were once directly connected to the ocean. Marine animals could, in theory, have entered those freshwater systems, only to become isolated as the ice retreated and the geography settled into its modern shape. Trapped populations like that would have had thousands of years to adapt to fresh, cold water, potentially drifting into forms distinct enough that they would not immediately match anything in the historical record. Lake Iliamna still has a working connection to the ocean through the Kvichak River, narrow enough that only salmon reliably use it today, but it is not impossible that the connection was wider or easier to navigate in the past. If that is the case, whatever moved into the lake generations ago has had a long, uninterrupted stretch of isolation to become something specific to this one body of water, adapted to conditions found almost nowhere else on Earth. It's worth being honest about what all of this evidence does and does not show. It does not prove that a specific, named monster exists in Lake Iliamna. Responsible reporting on a mystery like this has to hold two things at once, taking 80 years of consistent testimony and physical evidence seriously, while resisting the urge to declare the case definitively closed on the basis of eyewitness accounts, and one ambiguous DNA result. What the evidence does show is that something in that lake continues to defy simple explanation, and that the people who live closest to it have never treated the question as settled. Climate change adds a strange new layer to an already old mystery. Lake Iliamna, like the rest of Alaska's subarctic ecosystems, is warming, and its ice patterns are shifting. If there really is a population of large, cold-adapted animals relying on the lake's deepest, coldest refuges, a warming lake could push them into shallower, more accessible water more often than in the past. That could mean more sightings in the years ahead, more encounters with fishing boats and researchers, and potentially a real chance at finally resolving a question that has lingered since long before anyone wrote it down. It could also mean the opposite. If whatever lives in that lake is a genuine relic, an ancient population adapted to a very specific set of cold, isolated conditions, a warming lake might be closing the window on its survival rather than opening a window onto discovery. Scientific history is full of species written off as myth right up until the moment they were confirmed. Giant squid were dismissed as sailors' tall tales until one was finally filmed alive in its natural habitat. The megamouth shark was completely unknown to science until one unexpectedly surfaced in 1976. The coelacanth was considered extinct for tens of millions of years until a South African fisherman pulled one from his net in 1938. The deep places of this planet have a long track record of holding onto secrets far longer than anyone expects, and Lake Iliamna, with its 1,000-foot basins, freezing water, and single narrow connection to the sea, is exactly the kind of deep place where a secret like that could survive undisturbed for a very long time. For now, the honest answer is that Lake Iliamna keeps its mystery. The elders who warned their children never framed it as entertainment. They framed it as practical advice for living safely alongside something they respected and did not fully understand. 80 years later, pilots, fishermen, and scientists are still circling the same basic questions the villagers have been asking for generations. Something large moves through that water. Something has torn nets, dented boats, and left sonar operators staring at readings they cannot explain. Whether it turns out to be an unusually large, unusually social population of sleeper sharks, a genuinely undiscovered species isolated since the last ice age, or something else entirely, one thing about Lake Iliamna has stayed constant since long before any expedition ever arrived: the water is calm right up until it isn't, and the old rule still holds. If you see something large moving beneath the surface, you don't wait around to find out what it is.